Marcel. I write the blog Lesser Known Gems, and today I'm asking you a question, my dear audience. Do fairy tales exist? This might sound like a weird question, and I'm not asking it rhetorical. And it's not a new question either. Let's go back. What do I mean when I say fairy tale? Well, the way we classically think of fairy tale is having basis in folk tradition. Folk tradition is the oral tales that were told in houses and by professional storytellers before the written word was very common. And fairy tales, if you're going to be technical, has been named one of the subgenres of folk tales. So the folk tales that had elements of magic were very often referred to as fairy tales. Now, the reason why this term has become complicated is for two reasons. Number one, because writers like Hans Christian Andersen has used the tropes and the genre of fairy tales to create literary fairy tales. That means fairy tales that, as far as we know, don't have a basis on an oral folk tradition, but is something that he created and wrote down to entertain people. And the other way that it's become quite complicated is that fairy tales, while technically only mean the tales of magic, the tales that have a magical element to it, has also started to include other types of folk tales and fairy tales are very often mixed together. And when I'm going to talk about fairy tales, I do mean in the more general folk tales. Why the question if they exist? Isn't it? Of course they exist. We have books with them in. We have films based on them. Why then ask if they exist? Well, when they started to think that, oh, these are cool things that we need to collect, it was a reaction from the gentry living in the city reacting to the urbanization. So they were saying, well, we are now gathering together in these cities and everyone is learning to read and write, and this is corrupting us as a nation. This is corrupting us as a people. They were saying this was something good and great and that would be ruined if the people living outside of cities learned to read and write. Yeah, that's why we have collections of fairy tales today, because people who could read and write didn't like that other people was going to learn to read and write. And that's why it sort of becomes an interesting question. What happened to fairy tales when they went from the oral tradition to the written word? Because some say that it is the act of being oral that sort of made it good. Because what you hear that, at least in Norway, yes, people would gather around in houses and tell each other stories, but you also had something called professional storytellers. These were people who traveled around from farm to farm and were paid to tell stories. And of course, the better stories they would tell, the more money they would get. So they would then start to adapt their stories to their audience, and they would choose the stories that their audience would like and that were good and well received. And therefore, the bad stories or the bad versions of stories were lost because there was no use in protecting them. When stories are written down, when stories are created into film, it becomes fixed. It becomes fixed in time and in place and in the culture, and you don't have this fluidity and you don't have this ability to adapt to your audience. And therefore they're sort of saying, that's why fairy tales need to be in oral tradition, because otherwise we're just going to get good stuff, but also a lot of garbage, because there's nothing that was going to weed them out. And we do sort of see tendencies of this, not necessarily in the written word, but in the medium that is the main storytellers today for us, which is film. Now, let me explain it. Imagine the story of Cinderella. Yeah, you know, the story about the girl who becomes a servant to her evil stepmother, is banned from going to the ball, has her fairy godmother come in and save her, and then she lives happily ever after. And when this actually was written down, Perrault, who was the one who written down, he was a French folklorist, he actually created morals to it. And the morals around Cinderella was in connection to the fairy godmother, and how important it is to have a fairy godmother that can smile on you. And then some of you might be thinking, well, why didn't I hear something about the stepsisters cutting off the toes and the heels to fit in the shoe? And you're right, they did. That's the one in the Grimm version. Surprisingly enough, do you know what's not in the Grimm version? The fairy godmother. In the Grimm version, after Cinderella is refused to go to the ball, she goes to the grave of her mother, and her tears has watered the grave so much that it's become a huge tree, and it's the tree that actually gives her the clothes so she can go to the ball. So it's similar enough to know that this is the same story. It has a basis on the same oral tradition. But it's still separate enough that the moral, what was the essence of one story, is completely removed from the other version. So that's the same story and the same version of the story, but so different, based on this adaptations that was happening through the oral tradition. And the reason why you probably connect the story so much to the fairy godmother is because it's the French version that was translated by Andrew Lang, the one who wrote the books of fairy tales, the sort of the blue books of fairy tales, the red books of fairy tales. So he was the one who translated it into English, and it's Andrew Lang's version that we used by Disney. So here we sort of see that the Disney films, who sort of become the version that we know about Cinderella, has fixed the story of Cinderella. It's not up for adaptations anymore. It's not up for change anymore, because Disney, and Disney being so big, has sort of saying this is the ultimate right way of telling the story. The way that the oral tradition worked and functioned by adaptation, about changing, and about sort of saying that everyone was equal is lost because of how big Disney has got. So let's go through it on another way and go back to the original argument. Did learning to read and write ruin fairy tales? But let's sort of try and understand that argument. Who was actually saying this? Well, what you were actually saying was that were people in the city looking at a group of people, someone they identified as different than them, and saying that you can't have the privileges that we have because then you are ruining what we like about you. It's sort of saying that I, as one deciding what is worth and what is not worth, is judging a group of people and what they're allowed to do or not do based on my own preference. And the what's very difficult and what's very sort of about that argument is that then you sort of again also is losing the egalitarian part of the oral tradition and the oral aspect of the fairy tales, because then fairy tales isn't something that belongs to all of us. it belongs to the gentry, the people who know how to read and write. So let's go to a different aspect. John Storey, who wrote about popular culture, has quite an interesting theory. What he is stating is that folk culture developed into popular culture. So this is a different way of viewing fairy tales, that fairy tales hadn't anything to do with people who couldn't read and write. Folk culture didn't have anything to do with one group judging a different group. Folk culture was the culture of the masses. And that's a different side of this, that when these fairy tales were collected, when this debate was first happening, it was the minority who could read and write and was judging the majority of the people who couldn't read and write. So this is a different way of looking at it. Is fairy tales, or does the question of the existence of fairy tales belong to, do fairy tales exist as part of our popular culture, as the culture created by and for the masses? And in one sense, you could sort of say, well, yes and no. Again, we have Disney, and the company that is setting the precedence in how we tell the stories. And I'm not saying in the sort of the sense of the way Disney tells the stories, but how a lot of other content creators react towards Disney. It's about the copycats, that the people who steal the Disney formula because they know that that's the way I will make money. And in that sense, you can sort of, well, maybe not, because it's not really by and for the masses. It's by Disney for everyone else, and everyone pretending to be Disney, trying to trick everyone else that they're Disney. But then again, Disney isn't the only way we get this content. Disney isn't the only people who tell the stories, and Disney copycats aren't the only place we get stories. Do you know a huge place of fairy tale creation? The internet. The internet is the medium that, due to its, if you have the equipment, if you have the knowledge, which we got based primarily on reading and writing, is available for everyone else to tell the stories. And people do tell fairy tales on the internet, either through writing or through use of pictures or through the use of videos, among other things, on YouTube. And it's a way where people can react to the content immediately, and where the medium can adapt and change these stories, and you can mix these stories despite what other people and other companies might try to do. And in internet, and by the connections and collaborations that we find in the internet, we, the masses, create our own culture, and we, the masses, create our own stories, our own folk cultures, our own fairy tales, and our own versions of fairy tales that is just as equal and as valid as anyone in other films or in books. We've taken back not necessarily the oral tradition, but translated the oral tradition into film and to media and to writing through the internet by connecting worldwide. So maybe the question isn't if reading and writing ruined fairy tales and made certain that fairy tales doesn't exist. Maybe learning to read and write and the explosion of ability of technological abilities that created was what saved the oral tradition and what saved fairy tales. Or maybe Disney just owns our souls. Or maybe folklorists were right, and that reading and writing ruined us from ever creating real content and real art. I don't know. What do you think? Leave your comments down below, and remember, it's better to be a witty fool than a foolish wit.